Hello. Okay, today we are going to be talking about energy transformation. That is how the energy from the fuel that we eat becomes utilized for the energy that we need to do with our bodies and in our bodies. So we will talk more in more specifics when we get to each macronutrient later in the course, but here we're just going to talk about general concepts of how energy is produced in our bodies from fuel. Okay, so the body requires energy for nearly everything we do. We need it for mechanical work like running or writing. We need it for anabolic systems, such as forming more complex molecules from simple precursors, so such as immune cells, for example. We need it for active transport systems. So we talked about that in the last lecture, where um, some energy is needed in order for some molecules to be transferred from one side of a membrane to another, and also for transport of genetic information. And these are just some examples. We need energy to do basically everything in our bodies. And this energy is obtained from carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and ethanol. Now, our primary source of storage is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We will become very intimately um, involved with this compound as we move on in this course. So, this compound is an adenosine molecule attached to a ribose, and then our major site of action is this triphosphate here. So it could be ADP, diphosphate, AMP, monophosphate, but basically, this is the site of action. So between these phosphate groups are bound in these high energy bonds. When we need energy, we can break off one of the phosphates and use that potential energy stored in those bonds to do any of the work that our body needs to do. There also, when we have more energy than we need to use, we can bind these phosphates back up and regain that potential energy in that ATP so that we can use it when we need it. Okay, so ATP is generated through cellular respiration, and this is the oxidation of fuels, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, ethanol, from to carbon dioxide and water. Now, ATP is a major energy supplier in metabolism, and it's incredibly unique because it's an energy reservoir for the reasons that I talked about in the last slide. So here we have the adenosine triphosphate here, and then we can break off one of these high energy bonds, usually the beta or gamma bond, for these two terminal phosphates, and the molecule is converted to ADP. So it has two phosphates. So the energy that was trapped in this terminal phosphate bond is then broken so we can use it. So until we need it, it's trapped, and then when we need it, we have this huge reservoir of energy, which ATP can break into ADP and a phosphate and give us the energy we need. So these bonds are, so we talked about that. These are anhydride bonds, and the phosphate bonds are broken through hydrolysis. So when we break ATP into ADP plus a phosphate, the phosphate can also be transferred on to another acceptor molecule, and then that becomes a high energy bond on that molecule. Okay, so this is the cycle in about as simple of a way as it comes. So we have ATP here, and remember, this has the stored energy in its phosphate bonds. Then when we need the energy, we are able to break that bond and use it for cellular work. And then we have lost the energy in this bond. So now we have adenosine diphosphate and one inorganic phosphate. Then we get the energy from food, and we are able to rebind these two compounds. And then again, we have this stored energy in the form of ATP. ATP is formed by, just like we were talking about, phosphorylation, adding the phosphates, transferring the phosphates. So there's a transfer of an enzymatic transfer, I should say, of the terminal ATP phosphate to a molecule. So that's called the phosphorylation of that molecule. The phosphate from the ATP goes onto the other molecule. Now this is a two-step process. So first, ATP is broken up, just like we talked about, into ADP and an inorganic phosphate. And then this phosphate is added on to another molecule. So one very common example that we're going to talk about a lot in this course is the addition of the phosphate onto the substrate glucose. So if we have glucose and we have ATP, which has this stored energy, the ATP can we break the bond on the terminal phosphate. The phosphate goes to glucose to make it glucose 6-phosphate, or G6P, you might see it as. And then we have the ADP that does not have that high energy bond anymore. Instead, the high energy bond is on the glucose 6-phosphate. And then glucose 6-phosphate can be stored in glycogen so that we have this big store of energy when we need it to move our muscles. So that's just an example. Or it can be used if we haven't eaten in a long time, and now we have that stored energy that we can utilize. So the enzymatic phosphorylation of glucose by ATP is the first reaction as that glucose undergoes upon entering the cell. So think of this as kind of an energy investment by which we'll get a lot more energy out. So this is so the breaking off of ATP into ADP plus phosphate is a highly exothermic reaction, which means it's downhill energetically. This is just it wants to happen, you could say. It's going from a state that contains a high energy bond, and then we break it, and then we create a lot of energy. And because this is so highly exothermic, it makes the coupled reactions that are endothermic, that is, those that require energy, energetically favorable. Because when you put them together, it's still exothermic. It's still a downhill reaction energetically. So we break up the ATP, and that makes it possible to add on the phosphate onto the glucose, in this example, making a high energy bond. And this transfer of energy is highly energetically favorable. Okay. So when we break ATP into ADP, we continually need to resynthesize this ATP from the ADP because we need to have a constant source of energy for all of our body's functions. And our cells have an amazing way of maintaining the concentration of ATP in our cells. So if the level goes down a little bit, our cells know, okay, we need to make more ATP. If we have too much ATP, it turns it off for a little bit and says, okay, we don't need to make as much ATP. Now, ATP can be formed through two primary mechanisms. The first is not as frequent in our bodies, and it's called substrate level phosphorylation. And it's exactly like it sounds. So it's the transfer of a phosphate group from a high energy phosphate donor to ADP. So in this instance, we have a molecule that is not ATP. We have a molecule with a high energy phosphate bond, and it's able to transfer that phosphate onto ADP to make ATP. And then we have the stored energy in ATP. Now, the more relevant way that we have ATP formation is through oxidative phosphorylation, or I should say most relevant to our conversation. And this is the primary method of ATP production. Now, again, we just have to look at the name to have an understanding of what's happening here. Oxidative phosphorylation. Therefore, we require oxygen. And in the process, we produce carbon dioxide. So this is respiration. Another way you might hear this described is the respiration chain. So energy from the electron transport chain, or again, you may hear it as the respiration chain, is used to unite ADP with an inorganic phosphate to make ATP, so that we have this high energy stored in this molecule. And we're going to get into a lot more detail moving forward. Okay, so before we do that, let's take a minute and describe the mechanisms involved in ATP formation. So describe both the types of formation mechanisms and the reaction steps. So you can pause this. I'm going to go and do that, and then I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Okay, so let's go back to the first method of ATP creation, substrate level phosphorylation. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but basically there's a couple of different reactions of this type that are important. So the first is the anaerobic conversion of ATP. So this can only happen with the fuel of carbohydrates. We cannot do anaerobic conversion with fats or proteins. So in this process, glycolysis occurs, but only when we don't have enough, in the presence of an environment without enough oxygen. So this is critical for cells to be able to do this if there's not enough oxygen supply. So if you have respiration problems, think if we have a lot of plaquey buildup in our veins, and we're not getting enough in arteries, and we're not getting enough oxygen to our cells, or think when we go out and exercise, we might not have all the oxygen we need in order to use up the energy for the work that we're doing. So in that reaction, we would have glucose that's broken down to pyruvate. Again, we're going to get into all of this moving forward, but and then without oxygen, it doesn't go into the TCA cycle, but it can be converted to lactate. So think I haven't worked out in a long time, I'm doing a lot of work, there's not enough oxygen for my body to do the work, it converts it to lactate, and I feel all that soreness in the form of lactic acid in my muscles. However, we can aerobically train ourselves to deliver oxygen better so that we prevent lactate formation. Okay, now let's get into the bulk of the presentation and one that is most relevant for our topic, which is the TCA cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation is the major method by which we produce ATP that we need for energy. Okay, so this process, again, requires oxygen. So all fuels can be utilized for the aerobic conversion of fuel to ATP. Now, glucose first has to undergo glycolysis before entering the TCA cycle and being oxidized for energy. So glycolysis produces pyruvate that can enter the inner mitochondrial membrane, where it's converted to our common substrate for fuel utilization, which is acetyl-CoA. So, and that can enter the TCA cycle, which allows us to produce ATP. Okay, so this is my very advanced diagram that I made myself. So this is just repeating what I said before. So here we have glucose or carbohydrate. It's able to enter the inner mitochondrial membrane in the way of pyruvate, and then goes to our common substrate, acetyl-CoA. And we'll see here, and again, we'll go into way more detail when we get to the individual macronutrients, but both amino acids and fatty acids are able to also be transformed into acetyl-CoA. So this is our common substrate of all of our macronutrients, although amino acids can enter at different sites. So acetyl-CoA then goes to the TCA cycle, which then goes to the electron transport chain, and this is how we produce energy in ATP. So the TCA cycle produces 2/3 of the energy from fuel oxidation. And again, the common substrate is acetyl-CoA. Now, I don't think I can put very long videos up on YouTube. So I'm going to call this part 1, and we'll continue with part 2.